to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the story behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and long-time Apple user.
I'm Charlie Sorrell, also Apple user, also writer.
And we have a very special guest joining us today. It's a New York Times best-selling author, Leander Kahney, who wrote the definitive biographies of Jony Ive and Tim Cook. He's also the creator of the greatest geek coffee table book of all time, The Cult of Mac, and one of my personal favourite books on Steve Jobs, Inside Steve's Brain. Leander has been on the Apple beat for decades, including his time at Wired News in the 90s and aughts, and today he's the editor and publisher of the tech news website Cult of Mac, where friend of the show Dee Griffin-Jones is also a writer. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Leander Kahney to the show. Hi, Leander.
Hey, Graham. Hey, Charlie. Thanks so much for that kind introduction.
And all true. No lie detected. So we're going to do something a little bit different since this is our first episode of 2025. Instead of focusing on the story behind a particular Apple product as we normally do, we thought we'd take the opportunity to ruthlessly interrogate Leander to discover how Cult of Mac became a thing and hopefully uncover a few intriguing Apple anecdotes along the way. But before we get into it, if you'd like to support the show, you can do that by checking out our brand new merch store on TeePublic. We've got t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, tote bags, mugs, and more featuring retro geek designs by yours truly. And you'll find a link on our new website, applecorepod.com, and we'll also include that link in the show notes.
Those t-shirts look really good hanging on a dryer. Well, I came around to your house and you'd done the washing, and I was hoping to get one modelled for me, and they were just all hanging up to dry. So I guess that means you're wearing them.
I'm wearing one right now.
Oh, look at that.
That's a nice shirt.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So, yeah, do check out our merch store if you want to look stylish and yet very, very geeky. Okay, Leander, are you ready to be grilled?
I am, yep, sure.
Excellent. Well, one of the things I wanted to start off with, kind of conscious of the fact, Leander, that you've been covering Apple for a long time and you had a long spell with Wired News, and you were on the Apple beat during really some of the most pivotal points in the company's history when Steve Jobs returned and in the early aughts when he was turning the company around. And you must have attended a lot of legendary Steve Jobs keynotes in your time, and I was wondering what they were like.
Yeah, that's right. I was at Mac Week before Jobs came back, and there was a lot of turmoil and turnover with different CEOs, and then at Wired News when Jobs returned. And so, yeah, I got to attend all of those keynotes, and they were a mixed bag. You know, I mean, these days that Jobs obviously is lionized, but at the time when he came back, he was very much dismissed. Obviously, you know, he hadn't done so well at Next, and Pixar had yet to take off. So people dismissed Jobs as, you know, sort of a slick marketer. He was the guy who did the advertising at Apple when Wozniak was really the real genius. And so there was not very high expectations for his return. And so the keynotes, you know, in the early days, I mean, I got to admit, you know, some of them were kind of boring. And he would get really excited about, you know, something extra. Do you remember iCloud postcards?
Oh, yeah. iCards.
iCards, yeah. So he would spend like an hour demoing iCards, and I'd be sitting there in the audience thinking, you know, I got to file a story. You know, the deadline's like in an hour. What the hell am I going to write? So, you know, anyway,
I did get to attend. Yeah.
I got to attend all those keynotes, but the one standout one was the iPhone one. Like, there was a lot of rumors about the iPhone, but people were expecting, I think, an iPod or some kind of Newton, you know, not really the iPhone itself. And going into that, there was definitely a very, very clear sense of, right, this is going to be historic. You know, he's going to introduce something here that is going to really change the world.
That was Macworld Expo San Francisco 2007, and you were actually at the launch event of the iPhone.
Yeah, and it was, yeah. And that was when they, you know, he did the famous demo on stage, and then they had the iPhone in a weird glass cylinder so that no one could touch it. You know, there was a lot of, and it was going to come out 6 months later. So there was a little bit of, you know, this kind of like, I think people were disappointed they couldn't get it immediately.
Yeah.
But going into that one and the whole way through, there was like, this is going to be a big deal. This is really, really going to change the world. And it's a cliche, you know, because Jobs used that phrase so many times, but it really did change the world. And there was this feeling that, and it's going to take a little while for people to catch on, but, you know, that this is definitely going to be one of those world-changing products. But yeah, that one was definitely a great one, a really, really great one. They're often really fun. I mean, you know, he was always good. He was such a great showman. They were very, very theatrical. They were always funny. He was always good at telling jokes and stuff like that. But, like I said, it was often a mixed bag. Some of them were kind of a little bit mundane.
Yeah, like the were you at any of the John Mayer GarageBand demos? they seem to drag on a little bit to me.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, when they bring out the special guest, and you're like, okay, come on, when's the one more thing surprise coming?
Yeah, I remember I went to the launch of the iTunes store in London, and Jobs was there presenting that one, and I can't remember who I was covering it for, but we went along, and it was first thing in the morning. So you got a whole bunch of British journalists had to arrive at like 8 o'clock or something like that. And the coffee there was terrible and not enough of it. And then Alicia Keys came on before the main event. And I think she was trying to hype us up. She was like, morning London and the usual hype stuff. And no one was interested. All these jaded, half asleep journos, half hungover journos. And she's like, gee, you guys are a tough crowd. And she didn't even get a round of applause out of us. That wasn't a great one.
Were you ever, Leander, taken in by the reality distortion field? People used to clap pretty much every sentence Steve Jobs said. And did you, when you got away and then you came to write about it and then thought, well, actually, hang on, what did he announce here?
Yeah, again, it was a mixed bag. I think some of the stuff, the reality distortion field definitely didn't click in, but a lot of the stuff did. I remember going to the Aqua one, I think it was the demonstration of the first public beta. Or one of the Macwells where he showed it off, and where he showed off Aqua for the first time. I forget which release it was, but that was definitely another one of those ones where it was like, wow, I was so bowled over by that. I was so excited. I mean, I was almost peeing in my pants. I was up and down in my seat and like a kid, because it really was phenomenal. It looks so great, and it's so different from all the other computer interfaces at the time. So I remember being really, really excited about that one.
They had, I think, on stage, Steve Jobs invited up the CEO of Macromedia, and you could see, I watched this quite recently when I was researching Mac OS X, and you could see how bowled over this guy was. And I think he said, wow, Steve, that's not your daddy's product launch.
Right.
He was literally speechless. He didn't know what to say about it. Aqua was so different to any user interface we'd ever seen. It was really a step change for the industry.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on it, there were so many things that Apple introduced and still continues to that really do change the industry. I mean, look at Dell at CES this week. It just changed. It dropped all of its long-running brands, and now it calls its computers Pro Max.
Dell Pro Max.
It's shameless.
Maybe. Well, Leander, I'm keen to kind of get on to talking about your books, but before we do, I wanted to delve back into your own history and get a bit of the origin story of Leander Kahney. I think it's particularly interesting when talking to someone like yourself, and you've achieved, if I may say, quite a bit of success over the years, with your books and the Cultimac website, and I'd be really interested to hear the story of how you did it, how you got to where you are now. And particularly, I know when you started out in your bio, it says that you were a war correspondent. And I'm really curious for you to join the dots of how a war correspondent became the editor of Cult of Mac.
Well, first of all, I wasn't really a war correspondent. I went to a...
Okay.
I wanted to be a war correspondent. I had this romantic idea. I'd been reading a lot of Tom Wolfe and the New Journalism and Hemingway, of course, and had all these romantic ideas about being, this kind of dashing war correspondent in the war zone and parachuting in and finding all these amazing stories. And I ended up going to this refugee camp during the Bosnian War to pick up a bunch of refugees from Sarajevo, when it was under siege.
Wow.
And they'd all found their way to this camp in Croatia on the coast. And some people in Luton had organized this coach to go and pick up mums and kids who were in this refugee camp and bring them back to Luton. Luton of all places.
Yeah.
Luton in the UK.
Yeah, Luton's a typical dirty old town, not a very attractive place. There were 3 groups on the bus. There was 3 or 4 elders from one of the main mosques in Luton, and they were polite and well-spoken. And then there was the gang of robbers. There was 4 or 5 of those guys.
Robbers.
They were violently robbing people late at night in Luton's parks, and they were trying to look good for the judge. Their case was coming up. So they latched onto this trip organized by the Central Mosque in Luton. And then there were these 2 crazy mercenaries who commandeered the trip as soon as we got into France and turned it into a military exercise. So the whole thing was really bizarre. I couldn't believe it. And then the refugee camp was so bizarre, because it was in this holiday camp full of all these holidaying Germans.
What?
And they were all wandering around in their Speedos, all red from the sun. And then all these poor refugees from Sarajevo who were there in these tents.
So you've got this resort that's literally next to a war zone.
Yeah, well, it was a few miles away. You know, the war, the fronts of the war were sort of inside Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I don't know that exact number. It's at least 150, 200 miles, I think, away from the front lines of the war zone. But I forget where the front lines were, you know, they at that time. Coming on the way back, I'd interviewed these refugees, and just hearing their stories gave me PTSD.
Yeah.
And it just abused me of any notion of wanting to be a war correspondent at all. That was the end of that immediately.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was really upsetting. I was really, really upset, you know, because they're such horrible stories. Because the siege of Sarajevo was terrible.
Yeah.
You know, they'd escaped with their lives. And a lot of them were widows, and they'd had brothers and fathers and sons killed in the war. And they told these horrible stories about, you know, when just to get water, they'd have to face snipers and you know, a run to any kind of like trip outside that, and it was being shelled, of course, as well. You know, so it was terrible. It was horrible stories that things that they'd gone through. It was so traumatic that I was like, okay, I really don't want to do this at all.
I'm curious about that, because it's like you were covering there, I guess, some of the worst situations in the world that people go through, and it's like moving from that to kind of covering Macs and iPhones. It must be quite an extreme lurch from one extreme to another. I mean, people take their iPhones very seriously, but it's not really a life and death type subject.
No, I got into tech reporting by accident because actually I got laid off from that newspaper. I was working for a local newspaper. It was a free weekly.
Okay.
And I was doing an NTSJ training course, the National Society for the Training of Journalists. And
okay.
I forget what it is. Anyway, it was at the time, it was the only way to get into the journalism. You had to do this course that was run by the Journalism Union, and it was a 2 or 3 year course, and it involved learning a lot of legal stuff, you know, libel law, and also T-line shorthand. So I know how to do shorthand. Huh. So you could transcribe stuff. And it was a work placement kind of program. I got it through this job. I got it at this free local newspaper, but I hated working there. I ended up working in Luton, and I hated Luton. And I was dying to get into the newspapers in London. Anyway, cut a long story short, I got laid off from this newspaper eventually. That it wasn't doing so well. And I got a severance payment, and that allowed me to come to the US. So I'm a US citizen. My dad was American. He was the only American that emigrated from America to the UK in the 60s. And so by accident of birth, I've got this US passport, but I'd never been to America. I'd never been to the States. And so this layoff, the severance, I got a bit of severance money that allowed me to come to the States. And I was only going to stay for like 6 months. I had a flat in London, and, I figured what I'd do is I'd spend the money and I'd tour around and I'd see the States, and I'd come back and, try and get a job in journalism in London. I worked for a newspaper in Sacramento called the Sacramento Union. And this was this is a big, powerful newspaper. This is the paper that launched Reagan into the governorship and then eventually the presidency. It was a really strange right-wing newspaper. And when I got there, it was on its last legs. It was 2 sheets of paper folded over. It was the front page and the back page, and then this insert that was all guns. It was just gun ads. And this was the only thing that was supporting the newspaper. 6 months after I got there, that paper folded too.
Yeah.
And the one possession I had was a bicycle. I bought this cheap secondhand bike in Sacramento to get around Sacramento. And so that's why I got to be a bike messenger, because that was the one thing I had.
Oh, right. Okay. Because I know you're into cycling today. You're a mammal, right? A middle-aged man in Lycra.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the worst kind.
So this is the start of a lifelong interest in cycling, right?
I've always been a cyclist. I've always ridden a bike since I was a kid. So yeah, at the time in San Francisco, there was still a fairly large messenger community, and it was an easy job to get. I mean, actually, they rejected me the first couple of times because my knowledge of the streets were terrible. So I had to go and bone up on the maps and learn all the street names. But I got a job as a bike messenger. And I tried to get into the local journalism here, like, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Examiner was running at the time, and there was a couple of other newspapers, but, super hard to break into with no connections or anything like that. So the one place where you could get some work was working for, like, the tech magazines.
Yeah.
And so somehow, I can't remember how I did it, I got to be a PC software reviewer. The trouble is I didn't have a PC. I didn't have a Windows PC. I had a Mac. And so I just used to make it up. It's just really bad. I hate that. I hate to admit that. But I would, and then I would sell the software at a bookstore, so I'd double dip. But and then I got to do some fact checking for them and some copy editing. And then I used that experience to talk my way into a job at MacWeek.
Right.
And this is when my girlfriend got pregnant. I needed to get a job. So I got a job as a staffer there. And then I was freelancing, and they were going out of business too. There seems to be a pattern here.
Yeah.
But so I had a little bit of spare time, and so I was freelancing like crazy. I started freelancing for The Guardian and Scientific American and some other publications, and also Wired News. And so my connection at Wired News, like I did a bunch of freelance stories for them, and got friendly with the editor there. And then they were looking for a reporter, tech reporter, so I was able to jump ship. But this is, of course, Wired News was separate from Wired Magazine.
Yeah, I remember they were quite separate now in the old building. The magazine and the Wired.com were separate in separate sections. And there's a hall down the middle, and we called it the Berlin Hall.
Yeah.
Leander, you went thinking it was going to be 6 months spell in the US, and it ended up being a very long 6 months. I mean, you're still there decades later. So at what point did you realize, actually, hang on, this is more than just a trip. This is the rest of my life?
Oh, well, when I had 4 kids and a mortgage. For a long time it wasn't. I was a bit of a bohemian, and I wasn't really very keen to settle down and get a job.
Yeah.
My experience of corporate life at that point was one great disillusion. And which actually has continued throughout most of my career. But, there wasn't any plan. It was all happenstance. And, the same with the books and stuff too, really. I mean, again, continuing the theme, Wired News also was suffering during my tenure there. Nothing to do with me, of course. But
so we're just keeping score. This is 3 businesses now that you're, or is it 4? Because there was the local newspaper in Luton as well.
Yeah, I helped run them all into the ground. It's really a sterling.
You arrived in America. You helped elect Ronald Reagan as president, and you watched 3 businesses go into the ground.
You destroyed the newspaper industry. Thanks a lot.
Single-handedly. Yeah. In my defense, I think they were all on the way down.
Yeah.
And Wired News actually, did survive. I mean, Wired News at one time, when I joined Wired News, it had just got bought by Lycos, which was doing really well. It was one of the 4 or 5 very successful search engines.
Yeah.
And then within, I think, about 18 months, Lycos had gone belly up. And then we got sold to some Korean company. And then, anyway, I'd been covering Apple, the Apple community in the early days when Apple was in trouble.
Yeah.
And I found it kind of fascinating that there was this community of really committed Apple fans that were sort of banding together to save the company. And they had their own distinct subculture. And as I sort of explored it, I was like, wow, these people they're kind of like Hell's Angels, but nerdy ones.
I love that, yeah.
And they're devoted to Apple. And so I was writing all these stories for Wired News, and they were getting published. And I was on a daily deadline, so they were getting published on a daily basis. And then I thought, well, maybe I can collect all these up into a book. So I went and approached a local publisher, No Starch Press, and they agreed to make a book of all these stories that I'd written one at a time for Wired News. That's how that first book got started.
Amazing. So did you have the copyright on those stories, or did you have to kind of rewrite them for the book, or how did that work?
Well, I got permission from Wired News. They were actually very generous, gave me permission to reprint them. But yeah, it was originally Condé Nast copyright. I think they saw that there was some benefit, in getting the stories turned into a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were very generous about that. But then subsequently later, when I tried to take the Cult of Mac blog, which started as a Wired property, to promote the book, I started blogging about Apple. And so by this time, I'd sort of moved on to, I was no longer a reporter. I was the technology editor. And so my day-to-day duties, were mostly editing. And so at nighttime, I'd come home and I'd write 2 or 3 blog posts for the Cult of Mac blog for Wired.
Yeah.
And then when I tried to take that independent, I got really frustrated with a whole bunch of things there, not least of which the design and the technology platform. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to make it much better. And so when I tried to take it independent, they said, no, you can't do that. This is a Wired intellectual property.
Yeah.
You can't just run this like it's your own thing. This belongs to Condé Nast. And so I stopped immediately. And the blog had been quite popular on Wired.com.
Oh, yeah.
And then when I stopped, it tanked. And then several months later, when there was no traffic and no interest in it, someone said, okay, you can do it on your own if you want. And so that's how the blog got started.
Amazing. To me, that's just such an incredible break and a bit of entrepreneurialism on your part there as well, because you somehow managed to undock Culture Mac from the mothership and take it away as your own property. But that said, I guess that the name Culture Mac is something that you had created. It wasn't a Wired thing. It was the name of your book, right?
Yes, it was. And it was kind of a joke, like it was a joke that I stole from the Apple community. I mean, they always refer to it as Cult of Apple or Cult of Mac.
Yeah.
A joke about Steve Jobs' reality distortion field. And at the time, I mean, anyone who used a Mac was kind of crazy because they were more expensive than Windows PCs, which had become very, very cheap. And it was sort of seen as this irrational choice, that you would belong to this cult. You'd been brainwashed by Steve Jobs, and there was no rational reason for you to have and run a Mac. Because the company at that time was really in deep doo-doo and looked like it was going to go out of business for a long time. And actually, it took a long time for people's perceptions of Apple to change too. Even when it had started that run of successful products, it was still seen as kind of weird and not a good choice to be an Apple user.
Well, people still run stories to this day about how Apple is doomed. And it's, come on, it's the largest company on the planet. What does Apple need to do before it's no longer doomed?
Right, the beleaguered Apple, that was such a cliche for more than a decade.
It really was. To me, I mean, I remember when Cult of Mac, the book came out, it really resonated for me, that idea of the Cult of Mac or the Cult of Apple. I mean, I've read a little bit about the way that cults work, but it is definitely a part of the cult mentality of this in-group and out-group thing.
Yeah.
And being misunderstood and being a true believer is a really big part of that. And I definitely felt at the time, I was sort of digging my heels in, and I kind of liked the fact that I was using something that no one else wanted to use. There was that kind of perversity in my mindset. And I think, Charlie, you're a bit like that too. I think you like to use what no one else is using. That's why you tried to use an iPad as a Mac for so many years.
Oh, I wondered how long it would be before you brought that up. Every single episode. Yeah. I did, yeah.
There's a nugget of truth though there, isn't there?
It's a bone of contention between us.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so I guess the word cult has a negative connotation, but then also if you're in that in-group, it can have a positive connotation as well. But how is your feeling about that? Your website is Cult of Mac, and it's not like you're going to change the name because it has so much recognition. But how do you feel about it today? And does it still get strange reactions, or what do people make of it?
Yeah, it was the stupidest thing I could possibly have done. It was really bad. Talk about self-sabotage. No one likes the name Cult of Mac, least of all the Apple community. It's an insult, isn't it? I mean, and I don't think people sort of see it as a joke. And even if they do, I don't know, maybe it's not as... I think it was probably the dumbest thing I could have done, calling it that.
But not so dumb, given how successful it's been.
Well, I think in spite of itself, in spite of that. But yeah, I would have definitely have called it something else.
That's really interesting.
If I could go back.
To me, I think it's like a great name. But I guess one of the things is that Apple is such a different company today. It's so mainstream now that the idea of it being a cult is a little bit perverse. But there are still some true believers, like Griffin is a Vision Pro true believer. And there's some things where you still really have to drink the Kool-Aid to be a true believer. And maybe Vision Pro is one of those things.
I remember some years ago when I was still writing for Cult of Mac, and I was in a coffee shop, and in front of me there was a woman in the queue, and she had an Apple tattoo on the back of her neck. And even then it was kind of crazy. I mean, it's one thing getting it shaved into your head, like on the cover of the book and the Cult of Mac logo, but getting a tattoo, and I wondered if anybody would do that now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like getting a Samsung or an Amazon logo on the back of your...
That's right. Yeah, that's very true. Exactly. It's too mainstream. That's a good question, though. I wonder if people are still getting Apple tattoos. I remember people complaining about, in the early days of the Apple store, the Apple retail store, you'd walk in and you'd sort of be nodding, and other people around you, they'd have the white earbuds in, and this would be the place to go to meet your people.
Yeah.
Macworld was like that too. Macworld was, people would plan their weddings, their vacations around, Macworld.
Yeah.
Because that's where they got to hang out with their tribe. And when the iPod started to take off and get really popular, especially when it went to Windows, remember?
Oh, yeah.
After that, you go into the Apple store and there'd be all these kind of people that you really didn't recognize as Mac users. They weren't Apple people. They were someone who got an iPod for their birthday or Christmas. And
just normies.
Yeah, they weren't the right kind of people.
We talked about the Cult of Mac, your ultimate geek coffee table book, but after that, you've written a couple more books. One of them, which, as I said at the top of the show, is a personal favorite of mine, is Inside Steve's Brain. Where did that come from?
Good question. Again, it was like, my desperation for money, really.
I need something to sell.
Yeah.
But Leander, other people start selling their possessions on eBay. You decided to write a book.
That's the way to do it.
Well, again, I think it was to try to double dip on my reporting. I had all this material that I felt I could repurpose into another format, and books seemed like a good way to do it. I think it came because I did another one, Cult of iPod.
Yeah.
And I felt that I wasn't getting enough money from my publisher for these books. So I contacted an agent here in San Francisco, a literary agent, for the first time.
Ted Weinstein.
Yeah, exactly. Ted Weinstein. And he was the one who talked me into doing a book about Steve Jobs. It was his idea. I think I told him I had this vague idea. I said, I wanted to do a joke book called Steve's Little Red Book. It was a play on Chairman Mao's.
Mao, yeah.
Yeah. And it was going to be sort of aphorisms from Jobs.
Yeah.
About the way to do things. And he was like, it's an idiotic idea, that no one's ever going to buy that. You should do a more general book about Jobs. And so he was the one who gave me the idea and then set it up and then got me a big publisher. We got a deal with Penguin, which was fantastic. And it's actually kind of funny. I wanted to sort of tell this story. I was really, really excited about that. I got a fairly big advance, and this is going to be life-changing, right? I thought I was going to become I was going to pivot to become a book author after this. Yeah. So the publisher seemed pretty excited about it initially. They set up this big conference call. There was the publisher, Adrian Zackheim, who was a big deal. He had a lot of success. And then the editors, 3 or 4 of his top lieutenants. And then they had the salespeople, the Amazon salesperson, the national salesperson, all this kind of stuff, the international salesperson. I was really nervous, on this big conference call, thinking I'm going to get grilled. And I was thinking, oh my God, they're going to ask me all these detailed questions about the content of the book, the chapters and how was I going to do this and how was I going to get an interview, all this kind of stuff. And we get on this call and I can't remember, we started discussing a couple of things, and then Zackheim, the publisher, takes over and he's like, someone mentioned something about a new way to print silver ink on the spines of the book, and this set him off, and he was like, yeah, okay, right, I can see it now, yeah, it's going to be 3/4 of an inch, no, an inch thick, and it's going to be like 8 inches tall, and 4 inches wide. And he was talking about the dimensions of the book, and I was like, is this real? And he was running it through his mind, and he said, yeah, okay, it's going to be 8x4 and 1 inch thick, silver things. It's going to really pop at the book stand. Oh my God. And then he was like, okay, great. We've got it. All right. Thanks. See you. Goodbye. That was the end of the call.
The publishing industry is weird, isn't it?
Yeah. I was flabbergasted. I mean, all they discussed was literally the dimensions of the physical book.
Yeah. Wow.
The context didn't matter at all.
They worked out how big this book was, and then you just need to fill it up with words.
Was it that size in the end? Did they make it 8x4 and an inch thick?
It was actually smaller than that. They did end up running, it inspired a whole series. They did Inside Larry and Serge's brain, Inside Bill's brain.
Yours was the first. What I really liked about it was not only did you give the story behind some of these things, like how macOS 10 Aqua came about, but I really remember at the end of each chapter you had this bullet point summaries. So you took the story and then turned it into lessons that you could maybe apply to what you do yourself. And I clearly followed those lessons really carefully, because here I am 20 years later talking about other people's products.
Oh, that's funny, because I remember writing those and thinking, oh my God, this is the worst kind of hackery that any writer could possibly engage in, because I was definitely trying to make up some bullet points and I just made them off the top of my head.
I think that they were good bullet points. I haven't read it for maybe a decade, but I bet they stand up today. I think you did a really great job, and now I want to go back and I'm going to read that again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go take a look myself. But saying that, Jobs was a singular genius, and I think there were a lot of things that became unfashionable that he stuck to his guns and became huge assets. A perfect example being that kind of vertical integration, wanting to take care of everything, the hardware, the software. And of course, this was flew in the face of conventional wisdom for decades in the PC industry. And, any rational person could see that, they were crazy to do this, to follow this playbook, because Windows and Intel and that whole licensing business model was so successful.
Yeah.
And Apple just seemed to be riding this roller coaster into the ground because of Jobs' insistence on taking control of the whole widget. But now, in this new era, it is the business model,
Yeah.
that everybody's trying to emulate. Anyway, this is Jobs sticking to his guns from the early 70s.
That actually gives me another question I wanted to ask you here, which was that you obviously have this huge respect for what Steve Jobs did professionally, but your coverage of Steve, I sometimes get the vibe that you got frustrated with other aspects of him, whether it's like parking in the disabled spot or, there's these two sides to Steve Jobs. And how do you feel about that in terms of Steve Jobs, the genius, versus Steve Jobs, the kind of, bit of a shit sometimes?
Yeah, he was obviously a horrible man. I think in his personal relationships, and I think he used people. I think he used a lot of people throughout his life in his personal relationships and in his professional relationships. And he wasn't loyal to people. I don't think he treated people very well. Although I think the only person he ever treated well was Jony Ive. That's the only person I ever heard about he never yelled at. Everybody else, he yelled. He was spittle coming out of his mouth into their faces, kind of yelling. I always had I still don't know how I feel about this. That was one of the weirdest things. When he died, I got called up by CNN, by Anderson Cooper, and they wanted me to talk about Jobs, live on the air.
Yeah.
And I made a real hash of it because I was so conflicted and I was really waffling and I was going, oh my God, on the one hand, this is a huge loss. On the other hand, he's an awful person, It really wasn't a good interview. But that's what's so fascinating about him. And because he was a Buddhist, anti-materialist who ended up building one of the biggest company in the world.
Yeah.
He professed to be unconcerned about things like material wealth. He'd rather be a, wandering pilgrim in India.
Yeah.
But, he ended up amassing a huge fortune. He made business cool. He made business interesting. I never wanted to be a business reporter. I wanted to be, like I said, a war correspondent. But writing about Jobs and about Apple made it cool. And to my good fortune, the technology beat has become, one of the leading beats in journalism. And, when I first got started, I don't think we could have predicted that these devices would become so central to everyone's lives.
Yeah.
All the big stories are about tech.
Yeah.
And Apple is right at the center of that. So it's my good fortune to have been caught up in that. Definitely not a plan. I had no idea how it was going to turn out. But it's been lucky.
One of the things that Ed Catmull from Pixar said about Steve Jobs was that during those next wilderness years, when he was booted out of Apple before he returned in 1997, there were those kind of wilderness years where nothing was really working for him and he struggled to get Next off the ground. And for years, Pixar was going nowhere. I mean, Ed Catmull says that Steve Jobs mellowed in that time. He didn't just learn to be a better manager, but he learned to be a better person, and that the team that he put together at Next then worked with him for the rest of his life. People like Scott Forstall and Arvi Tavanian and so on. And so did you see that? Did you see him mellowing? Did you see him becoming a better person? Or do you think he was like still Steve right the way to the end?
A bit of both, I think. Obviously he had matured and had a family and wasn't so hot-headed.
Yeah.
And I think he obviously did collect a team of loyal lieutenants and people who were able to work with him. But, all the stories I heard was that he'd still yell at people. He was still kind of I talked to Baz Ording, who was a rockstar interface designer and not one of the managers. He wasn't a VP or anything like that. He didn't head up one of the divisions. He came up with like the dock and a whole bunch of effects in OS 10 and in subsequent products like the iPhone. He said that they would have a meeting with him every couple of weeks and Steve would want to see what was new, all the problems they'd been working on, what kind of progress they'd made. And he said it was, they were always nervous about these meetings because they never knew what Steve would turn up. Would it be the jovial, fun Steve who was having a good time, or would it be the Steve who was all stressed out because, something had gone wrong? And so, I don't know, I'm not really sure how to answer that. But on the other hand, these people, he said that it was like, it was the most productive period of his life and that Steve did a whole bunch of great things. One of the best things he liked about it was that if Steve liked an idea, that was it. That was going to get implemented. It was not going to get watered down in some committee. It was not going to get killed by some manager further up the chain. It was going to get implemented. So it was kind of exciting. He'd have these ideas. He'd present it to Steve. If Steve liked it, they come back, they develop it. If it worked out, that was going to be in the next release of OS 10 or whatever the product was.
Yeah.
And so he had a very fruitful career with Steve, and looks back on it very, very, very fondly and misses Steve a lot. He ended up leaving Apple because the company changed after he left. So I don't know. It's a hard question to answer. I don't know the answer, I'm afraid.
It's interesting when you talk about those different sides to Steve Jobs. And I was just this week rewatching the presentation in 2011 that Steve Jobs did to Cupertino City Council, pitching the Apple Park campus design, wanting to get planning permission for that. And after he presented this, which to him was the greatest office headquarters design in the history of office design, but then a couple of the counselors in their questions to Steve asked questions like, what could the citizens of Cupertino get off Apple for signing this off? Like, can we have free Wi-Fi, please, Steve? And you could see the expression on his face flipping from nice Steve to nasty Steve in a moment. And, it was funny. Every time one of the counselors said something nice, then there was this like charming, humble, really nice Steve accepting the compliments with a huge amount of grace. And whenever anyone asked, what can we get out of this, or why should we sign off on this, then you could see those micro expressions of rage, which I just thought it's interesting. You could see both sides of him right there. But the thing at the end of the day, and it probably doesn't excuse some of the behavior, certainly if you're in the receiving end of it, but my interpretation of all of that contradictory thing is he just had this incredible passion, maybe more than most of us do, that he really cared about his product so much that he almost didn't care what collateral damage he caused along the way, not just hurt feelings, but, hurt careers. Nothing could stop him from creating the best products he knew how to make.
Right. I think that's actually a very good assessment of exactly what it was. Yeah. He was like a First World War general, he was actually quite willing to send, thousands of people over the top, in search of, in pursuit of the most perfect, whatever it is, corner radius.
Yeah. So moving on from Steve Jobs, you then wrote one of the biggest, or the only biography I think of Jony Ive. And how did that happen? What led you to write about Jony Ive?
That was because by this point I wanted a follow-up book, and who was the obvious person to target, really? It was going to have to be someone about Apple, and I thought Jony Ive was worthy of doing a biography of Apple's resurgence, all those hit products over that decade period. He was one of the prime movers of that, so it seemed like this was the obvious person to tackle next. Surprisingly, they were very receptive to it. That was probably the easiest book to sell of all. The publisher was like immediately, okay, we're interested in doing that. The one thing I discovered funny about Jony Ive is that when I went back to try to interview high school classmates, high school teachers, and college classmates, college teachers, and I discovered that Apple had reached out to his former places of education and put a seal on his records.
Amazing.
Which flabbergasted me. They would not talk, and they wouldn't release these records at the request of Apple. It opened my eyes to the way that Apple, they were very, very protective of his reputation. And to the extent that they did this, I don't think there's anything controversial really in there. I didn't find anything controversial, but they want to control the narrative so much that, any kind of release of any kind of records has to go through Apple. You have to get their permission to do it. Anyway, I did get lucky with that book though, because I managed to talk to a lot of people who had worked with him. And throughout the years, he'd made enough statements in various product videos and various videos that Apple has produced to be able to string together an interesting narrative.
Yeah.
And I got really lucky interviewing a designer that worked in his design team for that whole period when he was there when Jobs came back, and worked through all of those hit products for a good decade. Doug Satzker, who was a core member of the team. And he was a fascinating interview. I talked to him on about 4 or 5 occasions, 4 or 5 different separate long interviews. And it was fascinating to see his memory just unspool in real time, because he'd not talked to anybody about this stuff.
Yeah,
because of Apple's secrecy, and especially with the industrial design team, the most secretive team. I mean, their studio was like a bank vault.
Yeah.
Inside Apple, and very, very few people were allowed inside, and very, very few people knew what was going on. And Doug Satzker was really happy to give me all the details. I asked a lot of detailed questions about the development of various products. And, he recounted all this stuff just, straight out of his memory. It was really fascinating to see him do this. And so I think I got a lot of inside detail that really benefited that book. That's the book I'm the most proud of, because I think I got a lot of stuff in there that nobody else had reported before.
There is. Yeah. I felt it gave a good just feel of Jony Ive's background. And, I'm always interested in those origin stories of how someone ends up getting to where they got to. I guess in his industry of product design, you couldn't really have a more successful career than Jony Ive. But there's a paradox there that I'm really curious to get your thoughts on, having done all of that research on Jony, which is, I guess if you speak to Apple fans, he has this sort of mixed reputation, because on the one hand, he's lionized as the genius who designed the iMac and all this incredible industrial design. But there was something quite singularly uncompromising about his design, which could sometimes lead to choices that were less popular. My own pet peeve, I suppose, would be, like when you have the USB cables during the Jony Ive era, they would always fray because they would never have Charlie, you always remember what this...
the strain relief on the cables, just so they don't snap off from the plug.
Yeah, so regular USB cables have a strain relief which stops them from fraying. It looks ugly, but it's very practical. And then minimalist Jony Ive insisted on having these beautiful minimalist cables that look great when the cable is straight. But in real world usage, they start to fray. And I remember almost every USB cable that I had from Apple, bits of metal were sticking out, and it was almost like they were just about to catch fire. They even ran a TV ad for the MacBook Air with a line that was something along the lines of, "You can never be too thin." And they had to kind of recall that ad because they hadn't really realized that was advocating anorexia. But it actually illustrated another thing, which is after Jony Ive left, the next generation of MacBooks got thicker and put in a lot of fan-pleasing things like bigger batteries and more ports and stuff. So with the benefit of hindsight and looking back, how do you reconcile those things of brilliant designer, but maybe too uncompromising in his choices? Or how do you think about Jony Ive's legacy at Apple?
Well, yeah, obviously a brilliant designer and obviously very responsible for a bunch of amazing design decisions that are proven to be very fruitful.
Yeah.
But I think perhaps towards the end of his career, got too much power in the company and became too revered and wasn't listening to important feedback that Apple seems to have subsequently incorporated, i.e., like you said, butterfly keyboards, bringing some ports back, making the batteries longer lasting.
Yeah.
Although I think there's a complex play here. So it's not quite as simple as the fact that, Johnny left and now suddenly it's gone back.
Okay.
The current lineup is better than they were when Jony Ive was in charge. I think that's absolutely fair to say. Is that because he's not there anymore? Hard to say, because a lot of that was his design team. His team are responsible for this current generation of products. So, maybe they would be like they are if he'd been there, because Apple had decided to listen to those complaints and take them more seriously.
Yeah.
Hard to say. I don't know. I think it's funny, but if you look at what he's done or hasn't done, he hasn't really done that much since he's left. And his interest in luxury products really rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah. What do you think of his designing the crest for Prince Charles, King Charles?
I was like, they should put King Charles's head on a pole outside Buckingham Palace. I mean, I really do fervently believe that. It really does bug me. And he's been working for Ferrari, and that $4,000 or $5,000 jacket that he made for that Italian company.
He reinvented the button.
Oh my God! They spent 3 years researching magnetic buttons.
That's where all the buttons went that he took away from the iPhone. All that after his war on buttons, they had a whole cupboard full. So we're going to use these up.
Yeah, exactly. He had a parts bin that he had to make good use of.
I always think about the video that Jony Ive narrated for the launch of Apple Watch, and there's this bit where he croons that we spoke to the world's leading horologists. And I thought that was such a Jony Ive thing to say. If he's going to design a watch, he wants to go back to the basics of understand watchiness. What is a watch?
That's where his genius comes from. When he was working for Tangerine, he had to design a toilet and a sink for Ideal Standard, I think the name of the company was. And, he spent months and months researching. He went back to Roman times. He looked at Roman aqueducts and how the Romans, got hot water into Rome and that kind of stuff. And, it was exhaustive. And he ended up coming up with this, I don't think it was even that radical, but it was I guess at the time, I think it was a sink on a pedestal. And when he was presenting it, it was Red Nose Day, which is a famous charity day in the UK when everyone puts a red clown nose on to raise money for charity. So here he is in this meeting with this company and the CEO has got a red clown nose on. And they rejected it out of hand, all this stuff. I think that's when he decided he wanted to go to Apple.
It's maybe best that he moved on from washrooms anyway, for our purposes. That is really fascinating. So from Jony Ive to Tim Cook, your next book was a biography of Tim Cook. And that must have been a harder sell, I guess, because I remember when you published the Jony Ive book, everyone wanted to understand the genius behind Apple design. But Tim Cook is a genius of supply chain, and that's more of a niche interest. So but that said, he's been financially the most successful CEO in Apple history, but he's a mysterious and private individual That must have been a tough book to write and a tough book to sell.
Well, yeah, the selling part was because the previous 2 books had done well. So it's like Hollywood, if you
they want a sequel.
Yeah, and so I think they were willing to hold their noses and go ahead with that. And it was too early, really. Unfortunately, I think the Tim Cook book was too early. His reputation hadn't solidified. He was still viewed very skeptically when I was writing the book. In hindsight now, you can see obviously that he has been very, very successful. And I would, argue he's up there with the most successful Apple CEOs and has done a magnificent job. And I think all the knocks against him that he can't innovate and stuff like that is pure bunk. But yeah, and that one was a tough book too. The weirdest thing, when I signed the deal, they do a little tiny announcement in some trade publication for the publishing industry.
Oh, it's Publishers Marketplace, right?
Okay, so there was a little tiny notice that this deal had been signed. And then about a few hours later, I get this call and I look at my phone and it's Apple's PR department. And this doesn't look good. So anyway, it was the head of Steve Dowling, who was heading up Apple PR at the time. And he was like, you've signed this book and we know that we like the Jony Ive book. We know this isn't going to be a hack job. We'd like to help you. And I almost had a heart attack. I was like, what, are you joking? Because in my whole career, I've never had any help from Apple at all. And it's all been sort of adversarial. So he said, yeah, we'll set you up with some interviews. And I was like, oh my God, this what's going on? I thought I was tripping.
Yeah.
So I ended up, they set up some interviews over a couple of days down, and I went down to the new spaceship HQ and I talked to 3 or 4 of his lieutenants, and it was kind of a mixed bag. A couple of the interviews went pretty well, and I got some really good stuff out of it. But a couple of the interviews didn't go so well, and were very scripted and very, very carefully controlled about what they were talking about. Like, I wanted some personal anecdotes about Tim. I wanted to get that kind of, what's he like in meetings? What's he like to work with? What's he like, when in a crisis situation? And a couple of the interviews, I did get those kind of details, but a couple of them I didn't.
Yeah.
And the publisher also was really excited about it too in the early days, especially after I told them that Apple was cooperating. And I thought it was going to get a lot of promotion. It got some promotion, but in the early days they were talking about like it was going to be one of the major books on their list that fall or whenever it came out. It's a strange business, the book business. It really is weird. They sort of pick these winners, and often it has to do with celebrities, to be honest. Like the books that really do well are celebrity books, celebrity cookbooks, celebrity tell-alls, celebrity biographies. And they put all their marketing muscle behind a very small number of titles, and then the rest you have to fend for yourself. And actually it did okay. I mean, it did fine. It got on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yeah.
And it was pretty well received. And I was actually pleased with the way the book turned out. The general thrust of the book, which is he's been criminally underrated, I think is true. I think that came through. And I think I managed to write the stuff that was implicit but not explicit at the time, like his interest in the supply chain, in the environment, in privacy. These were things that were implicit in his tenure, but hadn't really been made that explicit until more recently.
Yeah.
I structured each book around each of these topics. There was a linear narrative, but each chapter delved a little bit more into each of these topics and showed his impact on each of these different topics, had played out. And it worked out pretty well.
That's interesting because it's something I think you brought up really well in the book was those differences between Tim Cook's tenure and Steve Jobs' tenure. I mean, famously, Steve Jobs had no interest in charity. And although I think he later came around to sort of greening his products somewhat, it was more because it was a necessary PR strategy. I don't know that. That's the vibe that I got. Whereas Tim Cook, I get more the impression that he sees with Apple the potential to do something positive with the world. And I don't know if that's naive. I don't know if it's possible for a mega corporation to have a positive impact on the world. But I do think when he talks about that, it comes across as sincere to me.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That was one of the interesting things. Jobs had this reputation as this sort of lefty, progressive, hippie CEO, but he didn't care about the environment one whit, I don't think. The same with the supply chain too. You remember those horrible suicides at Foxconn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Around the time of the early iPhone, Jobs gave this very dismissive interview and said, oh, don't worry about it, we're on top of it, and wasn't willing to go into the details. And Cook really reformed that and set up pretty robust mechanisms for checking on the supply chain and supply chain abuses, and has had a remarkable effect on that and turnaround. Things like they put out this report that gets ignored every year, the Supply Chain Responsibility Report. But things like child labor were absolutely epidemic across the supply chain. I think it was like 2, maybe 3 years ago, the Apple Supply Chain Report came out. Everyone ignored it, but they had declared that they had almost completely eradicated child labor from their supply chain. They've eliminated like a whole bunch of really horrible chemicals from the production process. I mean, the fact that they've gone almost 100% green energy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is 4 or 5 years ago now. They're also doing that in the supply chain, which is really the hard part. When I was researching the book, I talked to Greenpeace, and Greenpeace were extremely complimentary about Apple, about Tim Cook and his greening of industry, because this has a huge knock-on effect for all these other companies and that are in manufacturing, plus things like data centers, which are huge energy requirements. Apple pioneered this, and I think it's hugely beneficial. And it would not have happened without Tim Cook and his sincere commitment to these things. But he's the one who really cares about this stuff.
Yeah.
And has had this huge impact.
As you were writing about Tim Cook, we talked about what it was like to work for Steve Jobs. What was your impression of, what vibe did you get in terms of, because he's such an enigmatic character to me. I think even when he's presenting, he's not charismatic like Steve Jobs. You don't get much of a vibe from him, and so I'm curious, what do you think it is like if you're working directly into Tim Cook? What is he like as a boss?
I think he's much more measured. Jobs was mercurial, and you never knew which jobs you were going to get, good Steve or bad Steve. Cook is far more measured, but he's very demanding. He was extremely on top of his duties and the things that he was supposed to be taking care of, and he expected it from everybody else.
Yeah.
I mean, I heard about meetings, like they're often spreadsheet meetings, like the supply chain stuff. They would know the supplies of the supplier.
Yeah.
And these are enormous spreadsheets, dozens of pages long, and he was able to look at a spreadsheet, and on page 5, one of the numbers had dropped in recent weeks. That was the kind of thing he was on top of. To him, it'd be like, oh my God, this could be a red flag. There might be some problem here. And then, he would turn to the person who was supposed to be responsible for this, and he expected them to know in that meeting why this number was dropping, what they were going to do about it, what contingency plans they had in place in case, this turned into a problem. That's the kind of management I think he brought to Apple, that level of detail, that level of commitment, and that expectation that everybody else had that kind of commitment to their jobs too.
There's a story I think I read in your book where they were discussing some specific supply chain issue with Foxconn in China, and it came up as a discussion point in this meeting, and there was an agreement that this executive should go to China to sort it out. And at the end of the meeting, Tim Cook expressed surprise that executive was still there. Like, what are you still doing here?
Right, exactly.
And he kind of expected you should already be on a plane halfway across the Pacific.
And he did. He took he went straight to the airport. Didn't pack a bag, nothing. Didn't go home anyway. Just went straight to China and got it fixed. Yeah.
So while on one hand he may be a gentler soul as a boss than Steve Jobs, in another respect, an incredibly demanding boss as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't get to head up a company like Apple unless you have this kind of extreme commitment. I mean, he'd get up at 4 a.m. in the morning, do an hour or two at the gym, probably working at the gym, and then would be, going into meetings all day. He doesn't have a family, so he was extremely committed to Apple and is still committed to Apple for a very, very long time.
Well, that's interesting. What do you see as a succession for Apple? Do you think Tim Cook is there for the long term?
Yeah, it's a question that's come up. I think it's a decade now, isn't it, or more, that he's been the CEO. Yeah. And of course, he's getting on a little. He's in his early 60s. It's a difficult question to answer because they haven't said anything about this succession plan at all. But I can say one thing. I think the one thing that will be sure is that the successor will come from inside the company. I don't think they're going to hire anyone from the outside to run it.
Yeah, I think you might be right there because it has such a unique culture as a company. It would be very hard for someone to come in and be sensitive to that. One of the impressions that I got in terms of Steve Jobs picking Tim Cook as his successor, because he very much was anointed by Jobs, was that maybe it wasn't a mistake on Steve Jobs' part that Tim Cook is not that charismatic and that he is modest and he's got the southern charm, you might say, that he was very respectful of Steve Jobs' legacy. He wasn't someone that came in with the need to put his mark on the company. Steve Jobs put lots of things in place, and one of the things that I remember I read in your books was this thing of the Apple University, and Steve Jobs wanted to encode the Apple way of doing things. He didn't want people to try and think, what would Steve do? But he wanted the culture of Apple to live on beyond him. I'm curious there, what do you think after Tim Cook, whenever he decides to step down, they should be going for a new charismatic CEO or another very competent manager CEO to keep Steve Jobs' machine ticking over?
The latter, for sure. Yeah, for sure. I think in Jobs' calculus, charisma and stage presence was very, very low on the list.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you can go back and look at some of Tim Cook's early appearances on Macworld, and it's painful. You really feel for the poor man because you could tell he really was extremely uncomfortable. And subsequently, he's become a lot more relaxed and a much better presenter. And of course, they've changed the Apple keynotes now. Before they were a one-man show, it was all Steve Jobs. Occasionally he'd have like the occasional guest presenter, but it was all him, which I don't think served Apple well. It gave the idea that Jobs was the wellspring of everything that was great at Apple, that he was, that all the ideas came from him, all the products came from him. And of course he had a huge influence and input, very, very hands-on. But, it came from the company, from all the people they employed. And you can see that very clearly, much more clearly now.
That's true, yeah.
In the range of characters that they bring out, that Apple's innovation is coming from across the organization. Jobs often said that the most important product that he ever worked on was Apple itself.
Yeah.
And his ambition was to create a company that outlived him. And he has spectacularly succeeded in that.
He really has. So any more books on the horizon, Leander?
Well, I hope not. I really don't.
Right, this is something you've said before. It takes it out of you to write a book, right? You don't love the process.
Each one was my personal Vietnam, my personal hell. Each one was hell, absolute hell to write. The whole writing process is just the worst kind of torture a human being can go through.
Yeah.
Or put themselves through. It's all self-imposed. I didn't enjoy any of it. But so having said that, I have long wanted to do an Apple encyclopedia.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah.
Like an encyclopedia of Apple. And maybe one day I might try to do a Kickstarter campaign just to see if there's a market for it. You pre-sell the book, basically. The audience for the book already pays for it before you even produce it.
And then you don't even have to write it.
Hopefully. I'm going to take the money and run, yeah.
Having spent my whole life obsessing over Apple, I would find it oddly reassuring. Like, I find it reassuring to do this podcast every week, to look at a product that is often a long dead product, and to just remind myself, and just like the old man that I now am, just like of my glory days, and I remember the original Pages. Yeah. What a terrible app that was. And
it's not much better now.
So I'm it is much better now. I'm so here for Encyclopedia Apple, and sign me up.
Okay, well, good. Thanks.
I want to be the first Kickstarter supporter.
I think I'd like to do an update on Inside Steve's Brain about the way that Steve Jobs really worked at work, because I've subsequently learned a lot of things. And I think that was a big failure of the Walter Isaacson book, was that he really didn't delve into how Jobs worked.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of stuff in there about, how he ran Apple and where all these ideas came from. The best book I read about Jobs was actually by the CFO of Pixar, Lawrence Levy. So he wrote a book that probably should have got more attention, I think, about his time at Pixar, from when Pixar was in trouble and losing money, and Jobs was propping it up, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and there was going to be a hardware company, and then it was a software company, and then they were going to do corporate videos for people, and they were really flailing around. But he knew that he had a good team there, and they kind of stumbled into making movies, almost by accident.
Yeah.
But anyway, Levy wrote a book about all this whole time, and then the IPO, which made Jobs rich. And I'm sorry, it was a Pixar sale to Disney subsequently, but he did make a lot of money from the IPO. But his book was clearly laid out, I think the way that Jobs worked, and there was nothing special, to be honest. There was no genius. It was just that they would carefully discuss all the problems, and they would lay out all the different scenarios and evaluate what to do. and there's nothing magical about that at all. It's all perfectly rational, and any intelligent person can follow this same playbook. But I thought it was fascinating because it busted the myth of Jobs, and it gave a clear picture, I think, of someone who was intelligent and engaged and willing to listen and figure out problems with people. And that was his secret.
But I wonder if, because it's those underlying beliefs and values that Steve Jobs had more than actually any one thing that he did. So to me, it's like the incredible passion, like focusing on products rather than making money. The money came as a result of making the best products he knew how to make. And I think, to me, he always said that. And that was actually at the heart of it. It was like right there. If you listen to him, he tells you it's like the way that I do this is by focusing on making the best products I know how to. But the other thing that I think that he, in that time at Pixar and Next, he figured out that actually the talent was the most important thing. And, you were talking about, like, Steve Jobs didn't do all of this stuff by himself. And to me, that's absolutely key. But the thing is, as much as he could be a shit to work with, he somehow found a way to find the smartest people, to motivate them and to keep them. And I think that, the reason Pixar was successful is probably because of John Lasseter. And the reason John Lasseter was there and got investment on films when there was no chance they were going to make any money back was because Steve Jobs made that bet on him. And, and I think you don't do that unless you're motivated by something more than money. And so I think that a lot of people, to me, get Steve Jobs wrong because they focus on all the money that he made. And that, to me, for Steve Jobs is secondary. Not to say that he's a saint, he wasn't. But he was really obsessed with doing great things. And, in that era, that thing he told the Pixar team of just make it great. I'm giving you my last dollar here, but just make it great. My favorite Steve Jobs story of all, and I think I read it in your book as well, was when he saw the iMac prototype he was going to present for the iMac launch, the original Bondi Blue iMac, and it had a tray loading CD drive rather than a slot loading CD drive. And he thought it was going to be slot loading, and he cried. And he was like in tears, genuine tears, not like, Real Housewives of Beverly Hills tears. This was genuine tears because he was so disappointed.
Yeah.
And I think because he cared that much, and I think there's few CEOs that would cry over a slot versus a tray, but that was an aspect of him. And to me, that redeems a lot of the arseholery because I really admire someone that just cares about something that much.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point. Yeah, exactly. All those instincts that he had for good design, working with good people, making everything excellent, were key to his success.
Yeah. So you've been very generous with your time, Leander. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and there's so much that I've taken out of this in terms of what you shared with us. Charlie, any questions or final thoughts for Leander?
I'd just like to apologise to all the people from Luton.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, yes, they're both delightful places, I'm sure. Leander, any final thoughts from you?
No, I you guys have been very kind, and I haven't, talked about myself so much for a long time, so I don't feel very comfortable about doing that. But I appreciate the opportunity to come on the show. Thank you.
Well, if the last person that interviewed you was Anderson Cooper, then I feel honoured to kind of follow in Anderson's footsteps.
Right.
So, Leander, we'll include a link to all of your many brilliant books in the show notes. Obviously, there's cultomac.com where people can find you there. If people want to connect with you online and see your work, where should they go? You've got a newsletter, right?
Yeah, actually, the newsletter is probably, I do, I write an intro for the newsletter every day. So that's the bulk of my writing these days. Yeah, newsletters.cultomac.com. The newsletter is really good. It's a really good way to see what we're putting out every day. And I think it's a really good digest. I'm really proud of the site. I think we do, it's the mix of news, reviews, and how-tos, I think is a great mix of stuff if you're interested, if you're an Apple fan, and I'm proud of it. I like it.
Well, Leander, thanks so much for sharing all that with us. Charlie, if people want to connect with you online, how should they do that?
You can get me at Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social on Mastodon.
Fantastic. And you can find me at grahambauer.bsky.social on Blue Sky. And do check out our brand new website, applecorepod.com, and check out our fantastic range of geek chic merchandise if you want to support the show. And until next time, bye-bye.
Bye. See ya. Bye.